You know that instant feeling you get about someone? You meet them, maybe hear something they did, and almost right away you kind of judge them.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's, pure admiration. Wow, I respect that person. Other times it's like, oh, nope, don't like their character.
Right.
But have you ever stopped to think what's actually going on there?
Yeah.
Is it like solving a math problem in your head? Pure logic.
Or is it something else?
Yeah, something less like reason and maybe more like, well, just a feeling.
That feeling, that sort of instinctive reaction, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at this really fundamental question. Where do our moral judgments actually come from?
Okay.
Is our sense of right and wrong based on like a cold logical process, a chain of arguments, reason essentially?
Hmm.
Or does it just spring up from an immediate feeling, an internal sense, like a taste for certain things, what our source calls sentiment?
And our source for this deep dive is it's a pretty major text from the 18th century, isn't it? An Enquiry concerning the principles of morals.
That's the one. Yeah, it's a later work by a very influential philosopher. And it's interesting because he was revisiting ideas he'd put out earlier.
Oh, right. Why revisit them?
He felt they hadn't quite landed right, maybe weren't fully understood, so he wanted to sharpen the arguments, make them clearer, really try to nail down the foundation of morals this time around.
Okay, so he's trying to get it right this time.
Pretty much. And his approach here is let's not start with abstract theories. Let's look at what we actually praise and blame in people, what gives someone personal merit.
Gotcha. So our mission today is to unpack his approach, see what insights he offers on what makes something seem praiseworthy. Let's unpack this.
Right.
So he dives right into that core debate then, reason or sentiment. Where does morality come from?
He does, and he pretty quickly dismisses what he sees as like phony arguments, people who claim there are no moral distinctions at all.
He doesn't buy that.
Not for a second. He basically says, look at the world, look at the huge differences in how people act. It's just not credible that anyone truly believes it's all morally the same.
Okay.
So the real question isn't if we judge, but how we get to those judgments. Is it reason or is it sentiment?
And he mentions that philosophers themselves have been a bit all over the place on this.
Yeah, a bit inconsistent. He points out that ancient thinkers often talked about virtue aligning with reason, but then their examples often sound more like, well, taste or feeling.
Hmm.
And then modern guys, they talk a lot about reason, but if you dig into their explanations, it often seems like they're actually relying on something closer to sentiment.
You can see why reason feels like the logical choice, though, can't you? I mean, truth and falsehood, that's reason's job.
Right.
2 + 2 = 4 everywhere, for everyone. Geometric proofs are universal. Shouldn't moral truths be like that? Universal, discoverable just by thinking.
It's a really appealing idea. That parallel is strong, but this is where the source brings in sentiment more forcefully. Think about, say, beauty or harmony in music, or even wit, like a good joke.
Yeah?
They give us pleasure. Right. But it's usually an immediate pleasure. You don't typically run through a logical proof to decide if a song is beautiful or a comment is witty. You just feel it.
You just react.
Exactly. And for those kinds of feelings, taste, beauty, the standard is just what each person feels. It's internal.
So if morality's like that, based on feeling, that feels less solid somehow. Less objective than reason promises.
That's the tension. And instead of just debating reason versus sentiment in the abstract, the author says, okay, let's try a different way.
How so?
Let's look empirically. Let's examine personal merit. What are the actual mental qualities that make us admire someone or hold them in contempt in real life? What gets praised? What gets blamed?
Start with the data, basically, what people actually value.
Precisely. Let's figure it out by looking at language in common life, not starting with some grand abstract principle.
Okay, so if we look at what people actually value, what does the source say is a really common thread?
A major factor he identifies is utility, usefulness.
Usefulness, like practical value.
Yeah, often it's usefulness to society, but sometimes also usefulness to the person themselves. He looks at what he calls the social virtues.
Like what?
Things like being sociable, good-natured, humane, merciful, grateful, friendly, generous. The qualities everyone generally agrees are good.
Right, the stuff we admire.
And he asks, okay, these are universally praised. Doesn't the utility that results from them, the benefit they bring, form at least a part of why we praise them? Maybe a big part.
And he uses some Some simple examples to back this up.
He does. Like, think about how we value things in nature.
Yeah.
We praise a fertile field or a strong horse because they're useful. We dislike weeds or wolves because they're harmful or dangerous.
Okay.
Even with man-made things like a ship. He says we praise its design, maybe its wide prow based on its utility for sailing safely. The beauty we might see is tied up with its fitness for purpose. Usefulness matters.
Right, I get that for objects. But what about people's actions? It can get more complicated, can't it? Our first feeling might change.
Totally. And this is where utility comes back in, often to correct our initial sentiment. Take giving charity, giving alms to the poor.
Seems like a good thing.
Initially, yes. Seems purely benevolent. But, he says, what if you observe that this particular form of charity actually encourages idleness? Maybe it makes people dependent, harms the wider community in the long run?
Ah, so you might rethink it.
Exactly, your judgment shifts. That impulse, which felt like pure virtue, might start to look more like, well, maybe a weakness, or at least misguided, because its actual utility turned out negative.
So the real-world results, the actual usefulness or harm, they shape our moral view over time.
Precisely. He gives another example. Tyrannicide, killing a tyrant. In ancient times, sometimes praised. The perceived utility was, freeing people, scaring off other potential tyrants.
Seemed useful then.
But the source argues history often showed it just led to more violence, more instability, made rulers even more paranoid and cruel. So looking back, the actual utility wasn't what they thought. Figures once praised might now be seen as poor models because the action ultimately caused more harm.
Wow. So our moral evaluation isn't static. It gets refined by observing the actual usefulness of actions.
And this idea of utility, this focus on consequences and benefit, he applies it really forcefully when he gets to the topic of justice.
Right. This is where he makes a pretty bold claim.
Very bold. He argues that justice, this careful, rule-bound virtue, all about property, rights, fairness, is founded entirely on its utility.
Entirely. That sounds radical. We often think of justice as something absolute, almost sacred.
But he says, imagine certain situations, certain hypothetical worlds. In those worlds, justice wouldn't even be a concept. It would be utterly undreamed of.
What kind of worlds are we talking about?
Okay, imagine a world of perfect abundance, like a golden age story. Unlimited resources, everything anyone could ever want is just freely available.
Like fruit just falls off trees constantly.
Exactly. No scarcity, no need to divide things up, no way to injure someone by taking their property because everyone has more than enough. In that world, why would you need rules about property? Why would you need justice?
Yeah, I guess it would be.
Yeah.
Useless. Pointless.
Completely useless. Or, another scenario, imagine everyone was perfectly benevolent, like limitlessly kind, always seeking everyone else's happiness instinctively.
A world of saints, basically.
Kind of. Would you need promises, contracts, rules about fairness? No, because everyone would just naturally do what's best for everyone else. Justice, again, becomes unnecessary.
Okay, so in those fantasy worlds, no justice needed. But what about the real world? He points to situations where justice seems to break down, right?
He does. Situations where its utility disappears. Think of extreme necessity, a shipwreck maybe, or a famine. Self-preservation kicks in, and the normal rules about property might just get suspended because survival becomes the overriding utility.
Right, you do what you have to do.
Or imagine, say, a virtuous person trapped among a gang of ruthless criminals. Following the normal rules of justice might get them killed. Self-preservation, the utility of staying alive, might dictate suspending those rules in that context.
Okay.
Even in a normal society, think about punishing criminals. We suspend their ordinary rights, their liberty, their property sometimes. Why? For the utility of society, for public safety and order.
And war must be the ultimate example.
The clearest example, maybe. Between warring nations, the usual rules of justice are just gone. They're not useful anymore in that situation. The so-called laws of war. He argues those are just rules agreed upon for the mutual advantage or utility of the warring parties. And even those might be ignored against an enemy who observes no rules at all.
So his conclusion is stark then. The rules of justice only exist because they are useful to us, given the state we live in. They depend entirely on our circumstances.
That's his core argument for justice, fidelity, things like that. Their entire reason for being is their utility to the public. Without that usefulness, the concepts wouldn't arise or they'd fade away.
He even discusses perfect equality, doesn't he? Some societies tried that.
Yeah, like Sparta or certain agrarian laws. It seems appealing, maybe useful on the surface. But he argues it's actually impractical and ultimately harmful.
Why harmful?
Because, he thinks, it destroys necessary hierarchy and authority, weakens the government, and ultimately makes society less stable and productive. So, counterintuitively, it ends up being less useful than a system with some managed inequality.
And the specific rules of property, like how you inherit things or how contracts work, those are also just based on utility.
Yes, they're conventions that societies develop because they're seen as useful for encouraging people to work, to be industrious, and to prevent constant fighting over resources. Things like first possession, long-term use establishing ownership, inheritance rules, they stick around because they generally serve society's interests.
He has that comparison to superstition.
Right. Yeah, it's a really provocative analogy. He says, imagine if society's well-being wasn't at stake. Then the rules about how saying certain words, making a verbal contract, can magically transfer ownership of something, well, they'd seem just as arbitrary and, frankly, weird as religious rituals, like a priest chanting specific words to make a piece of wood sacred.
Wow. So without the underlying utility, the rules themselves look kind of empty, almost nonsensical.
That's the point he's driving at. For justice and property, it's the social usefulness that gives them their force and meaning, not some inherent cosmic law. It grounds them firmly in human needs and the conditions of living together.
Okay, so utility is clearly a massive factor, especially for these really foundational social virtues like justice. But that leads to another question, doesn't it?
Which is?
If morality isn't just cold reason calculating utility percentages, and utility is so important, why does seeing something as useful to society make us feel good about it?
Right.
Why do we approve? Where does that positive feeling, that sentiment come from?
Ah, yes. And this is where he brings in the other crucial piece of the puzzle, sympathy, or as he also calls it, humanity.
Sympathy as in feeling with other people.
Exactly that. The basic idea is we aren't purely selfish islands. We're not indifferent to what happens to others. We have this innate capacity to, as he puts it, experience a sympathetic movement of pleasure or uneasiness based on the happiness, hey, misery we see, or even just imagine in others.
Can you give an example of how he sees this sympathy working?
Sure. Think about going to the theater, he suggests. Just being in a crowd enjoying something together creates this heightened feeling, right? A shared excitement.
Yeah, definitely.
The actors feed off that, and a powerful play can make us cry or feel angry or happy just by showing us what the characters are going through. We feel anxious for them, we get mad at the villains, even though none of it is happening to us.
We get invested?
We get invested. Or reading history. We react emotionally to the stories, to the people. We admire the good guys, we detest the tyrants, even centuries later. He says even just imagining someone else's hardship, like picturing a poor fisherman battling the sea, can create a kind of painful echo in us through sympathy.
So it's his built-in ability to resonate with others' feelings.
That's the key. And he argues this is how utility connects to sentiment. We judge characters and actions based on their tendencies. Do they tend to produce happiness or misery for society?
Okay.
And the reason we care about that societal happiness or misery, even if it doesn't directly touch us, is because of sympathy. We can feel, even faintly, the pleasure or pain caused to others. Our moral language itself, words like honorable, shameful, relies on this shared capacity. We approve of a useful action, even if it helps people far away, because sympathy allows us to connect with their benefit.
But our sympathy might be stronger for people close to us, right? How do we get a general standard?
Good point. He says we use reflection to correct our immediate feelings. It's like seeing something far away, it looks small, but we know it's actually large, right? We correct our perception. Similarly, an action benefiting us or our friends might trigger a stronger feeling of approval. But reflection, guided by sympathy for the broader impact, lets us step back and maintain a more general standard based on overall usefulness to society. Utility provides the standard, but sympathy is what makes that standard emotionally resonate with us.
Okay, so utility to others, plus sympathy making us care about that utility. That covers a lot. But didn't the source say there's more to merit than just usefulness?
He did. He expands the picture. Not everything we praise is about utility, either to society or even to the person themselves. Some qualities are valued simply because they are immediately agreeable.
Agreeable, you mean?
Yeah.
Just pleasant, not necessarily useful.
Exactly. Qualities that just produce pleasure, either in the person who has them or in others who observe them, right away.
Okay, like what? What's agreeable to the person who has the quality?
Cheerfulness is a prime example he gives. A cheerful disposition isn't just nice for the person feeling it. It tends to spread. It makes others feel good too, through sympathy or just emotional contagion. We naturally feel drawn to cheerful people more than, say, gloomy or anxious ones.
It's definitely true. It's just nicer to be around.
Right. He also mentions having a healthy enjoyment of pleasure provided it's kept within bounds, temperance and decency. Especially in polite societies, he says. There's an esteem for someone who knows how to enjoy life without being excessive or vulgar. He even quotes a French writer, something like, I love virtue without being grim, pleasure without being weak, and life without fearing death.
I like that. Virtue doesn't have to be miserable.
Exactly. And also philosophical tranquility, that kind of inner peace and resilience that comes from wisdom and virtue, being above the everyday pains and anxieties, that's seen as agreeable for the person possessing it.
Okay. And what about qualities that are agreeable to others? Things that make us pleasant company?
Well, benevolence and tenderness come up again here. Even if they aren't strictly useful in a given moment, they're just immediately pleasing to witness or experience. Think about it. Interacting with kind, tender people is just inherently more agreeable than dealing with constant arguments or criticism.
For sure.
And just being good company, that requires things like wit and good sense. They provide immediate enjoyment to people around you. He notes different cultures might value slightly different things. Maybe the French emphasize politeness and wit more, the English good nature and sense, but the core idea is the same. Having qualities that make social interaction enjoyable is valued.
Modesty, too. That seems about how you affect others.
Yes, exactly. Being aware of your own limits, showing regard for others' opinions. It suggests good sense, it helps you learn, and subtly it flatters other people's vanity because you're not constantly asserting yourself over them. Since, let's be honest, most people tend to slightly overvalue themselves, genuine modesty often stands out and is appreciated.
He even throws in cleanliness, doesn't he? Seems almost trivial.
He does. But it fits his point. Being clean makes us agreeable to be around. Being negligent about it causes unease or displeasure in others. So even something seemingly small like that gets judged as a minor fault, precisely because it impacts how agreeable we are to others. It's about the immediate effect on those around us.
Okay, so if we pull all this together, personal merit, the stuff we praise or blame, it comes from these different sources.
That's his synthesis, yeah. He boils it down to four main sources. We value qualities that are, 1, useful to others.
Like justice, generosity.
Right. 2, useful to the person themselves.
Like prudence, maybe, or hard work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
3, immediately agreeable to others.
Wit, politeness, good humor.
And 4, immediately agreeable to the person themselves.
Youthfulness, inner peace.
Usefulness and agreeableness, directed outwards to society or inwards to the self. Those are the 4 pillars.
And all of them, somehow, create a positive feeling in the person observing them.
That's the crucial link. All these qualities, whether useful or agreeable, communicate some kind of pleasure to the spectator, either directly or through sympathy, and it's this pleasure that triggers our feeling of esteem, of approbation. When we use moral words virtuous, odious, honorable, shameful, pleasure, we're tapping into this shared human capacity to feel pleasure or displeasure in response to these kinds of qualities. It's a universal principle, he argues.
It's a pretty neat framework.
Yeah.
But he does tackle a couple of tricky edge cases, right?
Yeah.
Like the sensible knave.
Ah, yes. The clever bad guy. This is the person who totally gets it. They understand honesty is generally the best policy. It's useful for society, usually good for them too, but
Good.
they think they're smart enough to cheat the system. You figure, hey, I can make exceptions for myself, break the rules here and there, as long as I'm clever enough not to get caught.
Like cheating on taxes or breaking a promise if you think no one will find out. You know it's useful for others to be honest, but you can sneak an advantage.
Exactly that person. And the source admits, look, if you're just arguing based on external consequences of getting caught, ruining your reputation, it can be hard to definitively prove to this person they'll always lose out if they truly believe they can be sneaky enough.
So you can't always refute them on purely practical grounds.
Not easily, if their heart isn't in the right place. But, he argues, this sensible knave is actually the biggest fool of all.
The biggest fool. Why? They think they're being smart.
Because they're sacrificing something far more valuable than any sneaky gain. They're giving up the internal peace, the quiet satisfaction, the self-approbation that comes from knowing you've acted with integrity.
Ah, the inner feeling.
Right. They're trading the genuine, lasting enjoyment of having a character they can respect, the pleasure of a clear conscience, for what? Fleeting, anxious material gains. He argues the simple, durable pleasures of a good reputation, real friendships built on trust, and just feeling good about yourself are worth infinitely more.
So the knave cheats themselves out of their own happiness in a way. It's a psychological cost.
That's the core of his rebuttal. The feeling of self-worth, rooted in these agreeable and useful qualities, is too valuable to trade away. The other tricky point is that whole debate about virtue versus talent.
Right, we often separate them. It's being smart a virtue like being kind is? Or is it just a talent?
He calls this a verbal dispute, mostly. He acknowledges we make the distinction sometimes, but argues the line is really blurry, both in language and in our actual feelings.
How so?
Do we really feel a fundamentally different kind of approval for someone with amazing judgment or quick wit compared to someone who is exceptionally fair or generous? He suggests the feelings of esteem and approbation are actually pretty similar.
Maybe. We definitely admire intelligence.
We do. And vanity often makes us value our talents quite highly. Plus, qualities like good sense are absolutely crucial for living well and making a positive impact, maybe just as important as honesty or kindness in many situations.
So, because these intellectual qualities are clearly part of someone's overall merit, and they evoke similar positive feelings, arguing over whether to stick the label virtue on them is kind of missing the point.
That's his take. It's getting bogged down in semantics. He points out, look, the ancient philosophers often didn't draw such a sharp line. They happily included intellectual strengths under the umbrella of virtue because they contribute to a person's overall praiseworthiness and success in life.
This whole deep dive, it really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Morality isn't just a set of abstract rules handed down from somewhere.
No, it's presented as something deeply interwoven with our human nature. Our feelings about what's useful, what's agreeable, and our ability to feel with others through sympathy.
It really grounds our moral judgments in, well, in us.
Yeah.
In our capacity to recognize what helps us in society function and what just feels good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, both in ourselves and others.
Exactly. It connects our individual character traits directly to the well-being of the community and to these fundamental emotional responses we all seem to share.
It helps explain, maybe, why certain qualities, kindness, fairness, competence, even cheerfulness, seem admired across different cultures and times. Whether we're looking at historical figures or politicians or just, the person we met at a party last night, that instant feeling is maybe tapping into these deep principles of utility and agreeableness.
It suggests it is, mediated by our capacity for sympathy. The moral sense isn't some mystical code, but emerges from reflecting on how actions and qualities tend to impact human happiness and social order impacts we appreciate because we're social creatures who feel for each other.
So here's a final thought to maybe chew on. If virtues like justice and honesty are, as he argues, founded primarily or even entirely on their utility, does that make them somehow less fundamental, less intrinsically moral, perhaps, than virtues like kindness or compassion that seem to spring more directly from our immediate feelings of sympathy? And what does it mean for a society if its collective understanding of what is useful starts to shift dramatically? What happens to justice then?